All right. Hey, sixth grade. Today we're talking about ancient Egyptian achievements. We're on pages 102, starting on page 102 in your books. So go ahead and follow along, have your notes out as well. If uh, you need more time to write your notes down while I'm still talking, go ahead and pause the video when I'm done when I'm about to go on to the next one. All right, so the first thing I'm going to talk about is Egyptian achievements. We've kind of gone through a timeline some of the main things that happened in ancient Egypt. We had the Old Kingdom, then the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. Right, there were the Hyksos in between the Middle Kingdom, the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. There was fights between nobles between the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom. And now we're going to kind of zoom out and talk about what are some of the main achievements that Egyptian society throughout throughout all these, so many dynasties, different kingdoms, and so forth. What are some of the big things they accomplished? And of course, if we're going to understand anything about any ancient culture, reading their writing is very important. So hieroglyphics, of course, is the Egyptian writing system, and hieroglyphics has over 600 symbols, and it's interesting because in English we go from left to right when we're reading or writing, whereas in hieroglyphics can go left to right, right to left, up to down to up, and any which way, which is nice and flexible for the people writing it and reading in ancient Egypt, but kind of confusing for us today. And of course, they wrote those hieroglyphics down on buildings and monuments and so forth. But most commonly, it was written down on papyrus, which is the long-lasting paper-like substance made from reeds. And uh, and and so papyrus, uh, you know, is with Egypt's climate being nice and dry, a lot of papyrus documents are still preserved and still able for us to read today. It was made by pressing layers of reeds together and pounding them into sheets. The sheets were tough and durable, but they were easy enough to roll into scrolls. And then they could write on them using brushes and ink. Now, for us to read and understand what the Egyptians written down, the Rosetta Stone is a big deal. It had hieroglyphics, Greek, and a later Egyptian language. So all those three languages, and once you have those three languages together, all presumably saying the same thing, that was allowed the first translation of hieroglyphics. And after we kind of got a code to read it, once we had a code to read it, then we can learn more and more about Egyptians. And like I said, that dry climate, which preserved mummies and stuff, also preserved a lot of papyrus documents. Now, it's not just the texts that are important. I guess some of the important texts before we move on are there's stories, there's poems, mythological tales. There's the Book of the Dead, which talks about afterlife. There's also love poems and stories about gods and kings. Now, besides just those building things, Egyptians, besides just the pyramids and so forth, temples were also a big thing that Egyptians made. So go on page 104, 105, you can see a picture of what a temple might have looked like. This is the temple at Karnak. It was Egypt's largest temple, and it's mainly to honor Re, the sun god, or Ra. Sometimes you hear it pronounced Ra. Over the years, pharaohs added to the temple's many buildings, and this illustration shows how Karnak's great hall may have looked during an ancient festival. When we see ancient artifacts today, they're definitely not as colorful as they probably were in that time. All right, let's take a look at our next slide. All right, another thing that we see commonly in ancient Egyptian architecture and building are sphinxes. Sphinxes have they're imaginary creatures, of course, with the body of a lion and the heads of other creatures, right? The Sphinx at Giza is probably the most famous one, and that was Pharaoh. It's a face of Pharaoh Khafre, who was one of the younger sons in the video we watched. Now, another thing that we see often in Egyptian architecture and building is called an obelisk. And an obelisk is as tall as four-sided pillars pointed at the top. If you go to a cemetery, there may be tombs with obelisks. That goes all the way back to this ancient Egyptian tradition. And, and of course, the most famous obelisk is the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C. Now, the Egyptian artisans were skilled with painting, stone carving, and jewelry making. Remember, it's a pretty highly developed society, and so you have lots of people, lots of different professions, and the stone carving, jewelry making still impresses people today. Let's see now. King Tutankhamun, it wasn't Pharaoh for very long. His dynasty didn't last long, but his tomb was discovered, and because his tomb was discovered and we could see his full tomb, there was an intact. We had an intact. Excuse me, because his tomb was discovered intact, we were able to really look at it and learn about what those tombs must have been like. Let's see if we can take a look at this thing. Oh, the link's not working right now. Oh, well. I'll show it to you when I get back to class. Let's see. Anything else? Those are some of the, let's see. Oh, you'll see when we talk about Egyptian paintings, usually they're not drawn to scale. Like we were looking at the picture of Pharaoh fighting the sea people earlier. Pharaoh is way bigger because he's more important, not because he's physically bigger, but because because he's more important to the idea that the artist was trying to portray. And also the people in Egyptian paintings are always the legs are always seen. People's heads and legs are always seen from the side. The other bodies and shoulders are straight on. So it gives people kind of a weird poses, and that's why you see people walking like an Egyptian, kind of sideways and goofy. So those are some of the main ideas from 4.4. All right, let's take a look at ancient Kush then. Go to the next slide. So Nubia, which is another name for Kush, was south of Egypt. It's rich in gold, copper, and stone. And the kings of Kush ruled from a place called Kerma. We're on page 108 now. And just like Egypt, it's on the Nile River, and so when the Nile River floods, you have that good soil, which leads to abundant crops. Now, for a while, those cataracts, those systems of rapids on the Nile River, were able to keep Kush safe from Egypt. But eventually, Egypt still came and conquered Kush and ruled it for over 450 years. But don't worry, from the people of Kush's point of view, eventually that is going to change. Let's see. So this is now the pharaohs that took over Kush on page 109 was Thutmose the First. Now he was, let's see, Moses and the Exodus is about 1444 BC, so about 60 years before before Moses leading the people out of Egypt is when we see Thutmose the first take over Kush. Now, he did destroy Kerma, the capital, but later pharaohs built temples in what had been Kushite territory. Now, the effects of the conquest were kind of blending of Egyptian culture with the Kushite culture. And you see the Kushites, excuse me, also develop. The Kushites also develop their and use the same Egyptian religious practices. Let's see. On to the next slide. But in the 1000s BC is when Kush becomes independent. The new kingdom of Egypt was ending, and the power of Egypt's pharaohs was starting to decline. And so the Kushite leaders were able to start to regain control of Kush, and it becomes independent. Let's see. And for about 300 years, we don't really hear much about Kush in Egyptian documents. But then Pianki was a Kushite king, and he takes over Egypt by 716 BC. And this Kushite dynasty lasts for about 40 years, and they built pyramids and even allowed Egyptian culture to thrive. Now, remember, at this time, in the 700s BC, is also when you have our friends the Assyrians really rising up and gaining their power. So it's at this time that after the Kushites have finally overthrow the Egyptians, then we have the Assyrians come in and knock off the Kushites themselves and take over Egypt. So the Kushite dynasty doesn't last long by historical standards. Let's see now. If you look at the little information box about Pianki, you see that he believed the gods supported him, and that's why he went to war. His courage inspired the troops on the battlefield. This is at the time still where you have your kings right there with the people fighting the battle. And, you would think that if you're a regular soldier having, as Egyptians believed, that the Pharaoh is a god on earth, you have the god, right there fighting with you, it would probably give you courage. Or at least you wouldn't want to let your god and king down as you're trying to fight a battle. So hopefully it would keep you from running away. Now, Pianki is also a big fan of his horses. When he was buried, 8 of his best horses were buried with him. All right, so yeah, that goes. Now we're to page 111. Let's see, and we'll talk about later Kush. Now, as we go further into Kush, we see that the new Meroe is the new capital. It's on the east bank of the Nile, and it helps Kush's economy to grow. There's lots of gold there, and forests of ebony and other wood. And most importantly, Meroe is full of rich iron ore deposits, so they're able to get iron, and it was those iron weapons that the Assyrians had defeated them with, and now they're able to do their own iron crafting. Now, you also see at this time, Meroe become the center of a trade network. And so we have a system of people in different lands who trade goods. That's what a trade network is. And Well, it allows people to have more luxurious things, but also, different foods and different resources that they might not be able to have easily at their disposal. And carrying those goods on a trade network are merchants. They're kind of the business people who take things from place to place. Now, being a merchant in ancient times sometimes could be very kind of um, uh, a job where you could make a lot of money, but especially with the people who are taking goods from place to place, if you're taking valuable things from place to place and you're out in the middle of nowhere, sometimes there may be bandits or so forth. Um, so if you want solid trading networks, you need to have kingdoms and governments that are able to protect the roads and the routes that the merchants take. Let's talk about imports and exports. I think that's in the next slide. Yeah, so imports and exports. So Kush's exports, and exports are goods that are sent out. So that includes gold, slaves, and ivory. Yeah, slavery is still a thing that we see in African history at this point. So exports means goods sent out. Think exit. That's one easy way to remember it. Excuse me. Now, Kush's imports. So imports are things that are brought into the country. Those included fine jewelry and luxury items. So those weren't easy. Kush is able to have those raw materials. Is also producing iron things and gold, of course. But some of the finer things, made by more skilled craftsmen, perhaps those may be brought in from other places. Let's see. Now, Kushite culture, they took some of the things that Egyptians did, um, but they also did some things that were different. They do have their leaders were pharaohs, and they had some of their own pyramids, not as big as the Great Pyramid of Giza, uh, but their pyramids were certainly impressive in their own right. But one things they did have different were houses. Let's see. Um, so their houses in the cities are formed by interweaving split pieces of palm wood or of bricks. Uh, Now, one of the things that the people did in Kush was also to hunt elephants and panthers. There's also serpents, and there are many other kinds of wild animals. That's from a Greek historian on page 111. They also had their own gods and their own written language. However, we can't read their written language. We don't have a Rosetta Stone, or at least one that works to kind of crack the code. Which may be why Kush only gets one section in our textbook instead of perhaps more if we had more information about them. All right, let's take a look at women in Kushite society. I think that's what comes next. Yeah, so we have Queen Shinak Dakito. She's the first woman to rule Kush from 170 to 150 BC. So this is at a time when people descended from Alexander the Great's general Ptolemy are ruling Egypt, and Cleopatra is part of that family. So this is kind of way fast forwarding from where we were. We were talking about around the time of Moses, and this is nearly 1,500 years later. It just puts in perspective how long ancient history was. Even for people who are in ancient history, there was stuff way before them. Now, one of the reasons that Kush kind of starts to decline, you see this on page 113, opposite the picture of Queen Shenectady, is that you see resources dwindling. They used up a lot of their resources. They let the cattle overgraze. A lot of the soil wasn't as well anymore because of the grass wasn't there to keep it because the cows came and ate all the grass. And if you're starting to lose goods and food, they're not going to be able to trade as much. So that wealth that we talked about before really kind of goes down. Let's see. Now, the kingdom located along the Red Sea was a kingdom called Aksum, and today is known as Ethiopia or Eritrea. And that kingdom grew wealthy from trade, and the king of Aksum took advantage and takes it over. Now we have by 8350 we have a king Azana. He destroys Meroe and he takes over Kush. And later on, the rulers of the late 13 in the late 300s, the rulers of Aksum, also known as Ethiopia, become Christian, and then years later, you see the people of Nubia convert and become Christian as well. And there were probably Christians in that part of the world even sooner, right? In the Bible, we have the story of Philip and the Ethiopian official. So there probably was Christianity in Egypt. It's pretty close to Israel, and so that was one of the first places that Christianity spreads to. You also have a large Jewish population in the city of Alexandria in Egypt. We'll talk more about Alexandria later when we talk about the Greeks. As a center of learning, there's a big lighthouse there. And there's also an early Christian community there too. And it's the same pattern we see with Paul when he's a missionary. You go to where there's the Jewish people first, and then kind of let the word travel from there. All right, that's the end of our slideshow and discussion. All right, now it's just back up to me. So that's some of the main things for ancient Egypt. If there's time, I'll have you take the quiz now. I'm guessing there may have been some times we need to stop and take the notes, though. So if needed, I'll give you the quiz over this tomorrow. Time depending is what I'll have our substitute here do. All right, that's some of the main things. If you have any questions, write those down so we can discuss them upon my return. We'll see you later.